Have you ever camped on the Devil's Lake? He has 4 suits to offer, but just one you will take. The diamond suit shimmers and the heart wants your blood, and the spade suit could help dig you out of the mud. But you picked the least haunted Campfire Club. You picked the least haunted Campfire Club. This suit is made to promote a spooky chattering and narrative variation, much like optical scattering. So let's suit up and go clubbing by ourselves in our beds while sugar plum skeletons dance in our heads. Welcome, one and all, to the final meeting of the Least Haunted Campfire Club for the year of 2023. Hope you all have had some kind of a summer, and we're going to round this train up into the station with the very first story from our good friend Tim. Archaeologist by trade and artist in oh so many ways. Tim's got a short story for us, accompanied by some drawings. So if you listen to this, Campfire Club without ever looking at the visuals, you might want to just peek at your screen off and on throughout Tim's story. Without further ado, here's Tim with some kind of story. I'm not sure what the title is, but you're about to hear it.
This is the first installment of a series known as The Inhabitants of the Place in Between. There is a place we all suspect, but none have ever seen. Within walls and floors and behind mirrors is the place in between. Doors to this place are hidden, and no human has the keys. But its dark inhabitants come and go with ease as they sneak inside our homes to do whatever they please. A darkened corner of a room, or the space beneath a bed, or the back of a broom closet, or a dusty garden shed, are indeed such doorways, inhabited with dread. Let us meet some of the residents of this dark land so well hid, some of whom you already know, but never knew you did. Let's begin with Mrs. Socks. Her sock-laden feet slip silently across floors, as her sock-mittened hands explore dresser drawers. No one knows how she chooses the assorted socks which everyone loses, for the socks she wears upon her head are black and white and striped or red, and the socks she wears about her waist are often argyle or other poor taste, and the other socks which cover her body are either plain but sometimes gaudy. But for every sock you lose, she leaves little pebbles inside your shoes. A warning to you, dear listener, if you and Mrs. Socks should ever meet, her appearance is not alarming, but she reeks of dirty feet. Our second inhabitant is known as Mr. Whispers. Mr. Whispers has a favorite game. In dark, quiet places, he whispers your name, sometimes sounding like a little girl, sometimes like an angry man, and sometimes barely heard at all, for scared confusion is his plan. And into late-night bedrooms he will creep, when you're in bed and fast asleep, and deep in dreams and unawares, into your ears he whispers nightmares. If you shudder awake or felt yourself falling, Mr. Whispers is nearby, or was recently calling. And next, we have the Collectors. Some say they look like spiders, some say they look like mice. Some say they are too fast to see, and you'll miss them if you blink twice. The Collectors collect small shiny things, rings, car keys, nickels, and cents. They hoard and stash such tiny things beneath couch cushions and within air vents. If you encounter a collector's hoard, a warning I must remind. Do not claim it all for yourself. Leave at least one coin behind. If you foolishly do not, they will rob you blind. And next we have Mrs. Dust, the dust maid. She is a dust maker and a children's breath taker. She is an eye itcher and a children's toy breaker. She coughs clouds of dust motes beneath beds unmade. She paints brown films and dust upon old toys unplayed. And she decorates all with cobwebs in her grimy tirade, and claims her canvases, all unkept places, as the domain of the dust maid. Next, we have Mr. Knox and Mr. Creaks. These two are often heard but seldom seen at all. One is the sudden sharp floor creak down a darkened hall. The other is the rap-tap thump upon an empty wall. Mr. Knocks and creaks slip into your home from the dark corners of an empty room. They seek to startle light sleepers, and to those awake, instill a sense of gloom. And here we have Dolly. Dolly is small and slim, with sharp, tiny teeth and claws. When Dolly goes dolling, a behavior quite appalling, through children's rooms goes crawling to fulfill her macabre cause. She sneaks herself inside of dolls, and in disguise she stalks the halls, and through bedrooms tiptoes and crawls. And if seen, she'll merely pause. Dolly plays a mean little game. She steals cookies and candies, leaving children to blame. She puts stolen things in children's rooms while camouflaged in doll costumes. Her nightly campaign is to terrorize behind hair of yarn and button eyes. A warning: all dolls belong in a toy box and secured each night with latches and locks. And the final entry in this chapter is Mr. Deltit. In apartment elevators and beneath living room seats, that space behind the toilet and in between bed sheets, and even well-lit places where a friend or family meets, Mr. Deltit silently wafts a stench that he excretes. We often may have smelt it, or even felt it, the eye-burning aromas from Mr. Deltit. A household dog cannot defend itself if it gets the blame, or an innocent father or friend becomes the target of such shame, and this is the point of his funky, stenchy game, for he's the one who dealt it. Mr. Deltit is his name.
In the summer of 1993, I was 13 and about to start high school. I had joined drumline the year before, which meant that band camp was now part of every summer break. So starting in early August, we would come to school to learn our marching formations and our music to be competition ready as soon as the year started. And of course, this included some light hazing of the new crop of kids, as I'm sure it does in all cliques. So this included tales about Charlie, the ghost that haunted the theater of our school. The story was that Charlie was a real boy who had attended our school in the 70s. He'd gone up to the boiler room above the theater and fell down this 50-foot drop. It broke his neck and died. And that since then, his spirit had remained in the theater. Mostly harmless, but sometimes annoying. So as a skeptic already, I was okay. Oh, whatever. Ah, ha, ha, ha. Charlie, great. So one day we were playing hide and seek in the dark theater, as dumb kids do. And it was 4 of us, 2 girls, 2 boys. We separated into teams, and we shut all the lights off except for one light on the stage, so all the house lights are off. It's dark in the theater. The boys go to hide. We're seeking. We count from the stage. We turn around, look at the house, and clearly, one of them is just sitting in a seat, midway back to the right in the theater. So we're like, oh, God, this idiot. Okay, so one of us go up the left, one of us go up the right, and we'll catch him in the middle. So at this point, the only way he can get past us is to literally run past one of us, which I think we were also doing. It was hide and seek and tag. If we spotted you, but you got to the safe point, you were safe. So we're coming up both sides of the aisle. We could still see him sitting there very still. And we jump at him. Got you. And there's nobody there. And not only is there nobody there, there is no cushion in this seat. It's just a seat back. And all of a sudden, we're kind of looking at each other quizzically, what's going on? And all of a sudden, from the stage, we hear both boys, what are you doing? They're both on the stage. So we're, what? What is going on? And we tell them, what? We're very confused. And they come down to where we are, and we show them this seat, and they turn white. They're like, that's Charlie's seat. The reason there's no cushion is because that's where Charlie sits, and they don't want people sitting there. So we hightailed it out of the freaking theater. That was the most scared I've ever been of a quote-unquote ghost in my life. That is the only time I think I maybe ever saw a ghost. But that was not the last time we got a hint of Charlie. So later on, we decided we're not going back in here alone, but we'll come in groups. So there was a routine of going to the theater in groups to just hang out, whatever, sometimes purposely to look for Charlie because rumor had it. Sometimes you would see the shadow of a boy with bell bottoms not walking up the wall, but you'd see the shadow going up the wall, like as if he were walking up the aisle. And he would also throw pennies at the stage, which was a thing. So you'd be on the stage or you'd be sitting in the seats and suddenly you'd hear ting, 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 and there'd just be this penny from nowhere suddenly on the stage. So one day later, this is probably the next summer when I'm a sophomore and I'm used to this now and it's my turn to haze the freshmen, I decide to bring my Ouija board. So I bring my Ouija board to school, and me and my boyfriend and another kid are the only ones that decide we're brave enough not to just use the Ouija board. Oh no, we're going to go hard. We're taking the Ouija board to the boiler room, which is exactly what we do. But this has to be a very hush-hush operation because obviously children are not supposed to be up there. It's very dangerous. But one of these other kids overhears us and pulls a little, take me with you or I'm telling. So we take him. So here we go. And you go to the back of the theater and there's a metal ladder that goes up to the ceiling. And at the top of the ladder is a door, just a door in the wall. And you go in there and that's the boiler room and the boilers are in there, whatever. And then there's the drop. Only now, I'm assuming after whatever supposedly happened to Charlie, there's a rope with like knots on it hanging from a pipe going down the 50-foot drop so that you can climb down, and if you were to fall and not break your neck, you could get back up again. So my boyfriend goes down. I toss him the Ouija board. I go down. My friend Justin comes behind me. And the last dude decides he's too scared, that if we're actually going to like go down this drop and we don't know what's down there, he's not going. He says he'll stay at the top as a lookout. So we head down, and all that's down there is we're now under the theater seats. So it's like trash and dust and probably rats. And we decide, you know what? Maybe we don't need to be down here to do this because there's no place to sit. It's like pipes and, it's not meant to be hung out in. So we go to get back up. We're going to go do it up in the boiler room. And when we get back to the drop and look up, our drumline instructor is there, busted. So we pull ourselves up the rope. We get back to the band director, who is furious, just rage. Like, I don't even know why he's so furious. And then we find out when he starts asking us which one of us took a shit in the boiler room. And we're like, what? Excuse me? And he's mad. Somebody took a dump in the boiler room. Well, the three of us know it wasn't any of us. We were together the whole entire time. So it's got to be the fourth guy, right? And we say as much. And he's crying. He's red in the face. No, screw you guys. I wouldn't do that. I didn't do that. It wasn't me. So we're like, well, must be Charlie then, huh? And so the scariest part of this story is the size of the monster ghost poop that we then were tasked to clean up because the fourth kid that was with us apparently got so scared he crapped. The end.
This is a new story that I wrote just for the occasion, and I'm calling it Trigger Object. The laboratory was nothing like one would expect when they read the sign painted on the frosted glass of the door. Parapsychical Communications Laboratory, it said, in small capital black letters. The unknowing person reading that sign would probably expect it to be full of all manner of arcane and pseudoscientific equipment. Perhaps chalk circles painted on the floor, dribbly candles, and of course there would be crystals. There'd have to be crystals. But of course, they would be wrong. The laboratory was strictly a place of scientific experimentation and carefully planned, meticulous study. Although the name might give the impression of cracked pottery and loose wheels, those who worked there were anything if not earnest and dedicated scientists. The students on the campus called it the Ghost Lab. The Ghost Lab, despite its dedication to hard metaphysical science, was still a bit of a laughingstock to the rest of the university, and the researchers therein often found themselves on the receiving end of all nature of hoaxing and pranks from other departments. These jokes included, but were not limited to, the staff arriving in the morning to find every surface covered with a glowing ectoplasm, which upon further inspection turned out to be personal lubricant mixed with the inside of Halloween glow sticks. Poor Johnson, the intern, broke a leg slipping on a sample in the middle of the room. Another time, the notes on the whiteboard from the day before had been erased, and in their place written in permanent marker were the words, "Boo! I am a ghost." Then, of course, there were the interferences with microphones and recording equipment. On one occasion, after being certain that they had captured some very credible electronic voice phenomena, they were surprised when the recording was played back. Mixed in with the static was a ghostly voice, seemingly ordering a burger from a drive-thru. "With cheese. Hold the pickles." And of course, the words, "Ghost Lab can suck it." But despite all of this, the research carried on undaunted. Professor Bill Barrett had been head of the Parapsychical Communications Laboratory for 6 years, and in all of that time had made no progress whatsoever in proving even in the slightest that there was any life after this one. Nor had he been able to collect any evidence to suggest that certain individuals might have a predilection towards psychic abilities. If anything, the only thing he was able to prove beyond a doubt was that the scientists working in the theoretical physics department were major dicks. He was also certain that if his research wasn't sabotaged time and time again by the other departments, that he might have actually been able to get some real evidence, and he was indeed feeling the pressure. The president of the university had recently made it clear that if results were not forthcoming soon, then the laboratory would have its funding cut, and it could be disbanded. As the president had said, "We need results, Bill. After all, we need to think of the endowment. Look, I know the experimental physics lab is a bunch of assholes as well as you do, but they get results. Hell, the other day, Dr. Protussis phased the molecules of my car's tires into the asphalt of the parking lot. I wasn't even mad, and you know why? Because that stunt gained us another $3 million from our benefactors. It's very hard to justify your little seances and Ouija board sessions when Protussis is smashing particles together and potentially jeopardizing the very fabric of the universe itself. That kind of research is sexy. That kind of research gets clicks. Yours just gets laughs." And Bill had been forced to agree that his laboratory did not produce any results, and that from a strictly business perspective, it was, as they say, bad for business. But what the university president did not know, and what the rock stars in the theoretical physics department did not know, and not even the other members of his team knew, Professor Barrett had been working on a little project in secret. Each evening after returning home from the lab, and after eating a small yet efficient dinner, he would retreat to his garage and his home laboratory. This one did have the chalk circles and dribbly candles, although those were purely the results of earlier failed experimentation. Lately, he had been experimenting with crystals, more specifically with the piezoelectric properties of quartz crystals. It had taken him months to fine-tune a small quartz crystal, much like the one in a wristwatch, to a sensitivity level in which the merest fluctuations of atmospheric pressure could create a small charge. This charge would then feed a random number generator, which was then run through an algorithm and fed into a word bank. The idea being that any presence could affect the crystal, which in turn would generate a number, which then produced a word response. If the presence was intelligent, it could conceivably apply more or less pressure to the crystal, and in doing so, influence the number generator, and therefore choose the appropriate words with which to answer a question posed by an observer. So far, he had limited success. No matter what question he asked, the response words were always nonsensical and random. If anything, this just proved that the random number generator to word bank algorithm was working. Alas, it did not prove any sort of afterlife consciousness. But all of that was about to change. This time, Barrett had decided to introduce another variable, what was known in the paranormal circles as a trigger object. A trigger object was an item that was either believed to be itself haunted or to be an item of particular contextual relevance to a haunting, the presence of which would then trigger a reaction from whatever presence may be nearby. For example, say one was trying to contact the spirit of an executed prisoner in a supposedly haunted jail. If the method of execution was hanging, the presence of a hangman's noose would be an excellent trigger object. More so if it was the actual rope used for the execution. Better yet would be to have an actual body part of the prisoner, but that could be particularly difficult to find. In this case, the trigger object was a large trunk, in the style of what used to be called a steamer trunk. And this one was very definitely an antique. It was made of old worm-eaten wood and slightly rotten leather. The brass bands that wrapped around the trunk to give it some strength and structure were tarnished and pockmarked. Professor Barrett had searched long and hard to find the trunk, but had actually lucked out one day while somewhat mindlessly scrolling on eBay and got it for a steal. The trunk itself actually wasn't that special, but it was old, and it looked the part, and that was half of its value. He had taken the university president's words to heart, and now knew that appearance was going to be key to the success of his experiment. The research had to be click-worthy. He could come up with just about any backstory for the trunk, and he had. As far as anyone else was to be concerned, the trunk came from a very famous and ill-fated ocean vessel. That detail alone would get attention. In all truth, the trunk was not the trigger object. It was what was inside that was the trigger object. On top of the trunk, Barrett had set up his spirit communication device. This, too, he had expanded to make more theatrical. The actual mechanism of piezo crystal to process a word bank was very simple and small, so Barrett had constructed a decoy device 3 times the size of the real one, with blinking LED lights and knobs and little mechanical arms that would bounce up and down on graph paper, and at the end was a little strip of paper that would print out the responses. A small bell would even add a very pleasing ting sound when the printout was finished. The real device was of course hidden inside, and still did all the heavy lifting, as it were. If the benefactors wanted a show, he would give them a show, but first he needed to ensure that it all actually worked, which brings us back to the current experiment. Professor Barrett decided to really go for the theatrics this time. He lit the dribbly candles and lowered the ceiling lights. He then turned on the fake machine which contained the real device inside. The on switch made a very satisfyingly loud click, which was followed by the sound of vacuum tubes warming up. He reached down and knocked on the trunk 3 times. "You hear me in there?" he said out loud. "If there is any presence here with me right now, make your presence known. You can use this device to answer me." He waited for an answer. Nothing. "I said, is there any presences here? You can use this machine to answer. Do you understand?" Still, nothing. His anger was rising. After everything he had gone through to set this experiment up, and the pressure for results, and the imagined laughter of Dr. Protussis in the theoretical physics lab, he would not be disrespected again. Not tonight, and not by him. He kicked the trunk swiftly, and it gave a stressful crack. "I know you are in there, you son of a bitch. Now answer me." Suddenly, the machine started to hum. The little mechanical arm began to dance on the graph paper, and the lights blinked and flashed. Then the printer began to work. He tore off the paper and held it in the candlelight to read the response. "I am here. I am listening." This was new. In the past, the responses had always been random, single words out of context, like daffodil or car. If there were ever multiple word responses, they were equally nonsensical, like paper monkey blue or honker soda dog, for example. But here was something that actually implied intelligence. Barrett smiled to himself and then laughed out loud. Eureka! The trigger object plan might have actually worked, but of course results must be repeatable for it to be science. "Do you know where you are?" he asked the air. The device hummed again. The graph arm scratched, the bell tinged, and the paper came out. Garage. Trunk. Hell. This was interesting. Barrett looked forward to a night of experimentation. A few days later, Professor Barrett stood in the middle of the Parapsychical Communications Laboratory. Next to him was the trunk, with the device sitting atop. There were a few rows of folding metal chairs set up, and in them were the various interns and team members, as well as wealthy university benefactors, and of course, the president of the university. Dr. Protussis hadn't been seen for a few days. Rumor amongst the grad students was that he had accidentally phased himself into the floor of one of the university's men's rooms, or that he had teleported himself somewhere far away. All the same, there was an empty chair that had been reserved for him. It would be such a victory to reveal the positive results and rub them in his stupid face. Barrett looked at his wristwatch and noted the time. He then nodded to one of his assistants, who obediently moved to close the doors and turn down the lights. Professor Barrett and his device now stood bathed in a circle of light, the effect being very much like that of a magician on a stage. He cleared his throat and began. Friends, colleagues, esteemed members of the board, and of course, Mrs. President, I am here to show you the amazing fruits of all of our labor here in the Parapsychical Communication Laboratory. Since the beginning of man's reckoning, he has wondered about the answer to the biggest question to ever follow the first question. And the first question was this: where did I come from? And so logically, of course, the second question, the one we have finally answered here in this laboratory, is this: where am I going? I am here to tell you and show you undeniable proof of an intelligence that lasts beyond the end of this physical life. There were some murmurs from those assembled. Oh, you can scoff all you wish, ladies and gentlemen, but the results will speak for themselves. Allow me to show you the device. He then proceeded to explain the clever mechanics and theory behind the crystal and number generator, the word bank. However, he jazzed up the language, of course. He threw in buzzworthy keywords like energy fields and resonances, frequencies, and so forth. Then he turned to the trigger object and gave the false backstory. This trunk was recovered floating on the surface after the wreck of the RMS Titanic. Records show that the person who it belonged to perished in that terrible tragedy. We will now, with my device, attempt to communicate with that poor soul. He then flicked on the device with the satisfyingly loud switch. The tubes began to hum. The lights lit up. The device is now in standby mode, which means it is fully receptive to the forces of the spirits present. I will now invite the spirit to communicate thusly. He then knocked on the trunk 3 times. Hello in there. Are you with us? The device hummed. The little arm danced on the graph paper. He tore off the slip and read it. I am here. I am listening. Someone in the audience called out, That doesn't prove anything! You are quite right, said the professor. But let's try another question then. Spirit, can you tell me how many people are in this room right now? There were a few moments of silence before the device sprang to life. There are 28 living persons in this room. Can we get a count? Said Barrett. One of the interns quickly tallied those present and then announced to the room, 28. Again, the voice from the audience said, You already knew how many people were coming. You could have pre-programmed that response. Well, firstly, that is not true. I was sure that Dr. Protussis would be here, but alas, he is not in his chair. In that case, it would have been 29 living persons, wouldn't it? Hang on, the university president spoke up. What did it mean, living persons? Ah, excellent question, ma'am, exclaimed Professor Barrett. And that brings up the second piece of my defense against accusations of fraud. Why don't you ask it a question yourself? That would be something that I would have no way of knowing, and therefore could not pre-program a response to. The president hesitantly got to her feet and approached the trunk and device. What do I do? Just ask your question. Spirit, the president began. Spirit, what do you mean by living persons? Are there other non-living persons present? There are many non-living persons present. Here with us now? Everywhere. Countless. Always. Before another question could be asked, the device began to hum again. We are always watching. We are always listening. Never alone. Waiting. The president looked troubled and slightly disturbed after Barrett read the last response aloud. Barrett addressed the small crowd. Anyone else want to try? The voice of earlier descent stood up. It was one of the fools from the theoretical physics lab. I've got a few questions. Barrett almost sneered. By all means, then, come up and ask. The young physicist approached and stepped into the spotlight. Spirit, what happens after death? The machine hummed a little longer this time, and the lights, if possible, blinked a little bit harder. Darkness, pain, anger, retribution, always watching, always listening, always waiting. Well, that's a little spooky and ominous. I'll give you an A for theatrics, Professor Barrett, said the physicist. But Barrett wasn't looking at him. He was casting his eyes furtively around the room. A small patch of sweat had started to form on his brow. The shadows in the corners of the room had become a little bit troubling to him. He sputtered. What was that? He finally tore his eyes from the darkness and looked at the physicist. I said, well done on the theatrics, but I still don't buy it. Well, why don't you ask it another question, then, if you aren't satisfied? Barrett was growing paler. A crash in the back of the laboratory made him jump, and he turned to look in that direction. One of the assistants rushed over to see what had happened and called out, Just a beaker that fell over. I'll clean it up. Carry on. Back in the spotlight, the physicist addressed the trunk again. Spirit, do you know where you are? University. Trunk. Ghost lab. Professor Barrett gave a start and stared at the trunk. Had it just said ghost lab? Spirit, the physicist spoke again. How did you die? Murder. Violence. Oh, well, that is interesting, said the physicist. I thought this trunk came from the Titanic. Are we not speaking to a passenger of the Titanic? Barrett held his breath. No. Doctor. Scientist. In the trunk. The near silence of the room was broken by Barrett's scream. No! You fool! You'll ruin everything! And he lunged at the young physicist. There was a brief tussle, which ended with both men toppling over onto the trunk, knocking the device to the floor. The lights began to flash, and one of the tubes popped loudly. The little arm over the graph paper snapped, but it still struggled to oscillate pathetically. The top of the trunk cracked under the combined weight of two grown men, and then collapsed inwards. Those assembled rushed forward to separate the men and extricate them from the wreckage of the trunk. As they got close, they noticed the smell, the foul, unmistakable, sulphurous, and rotten stench of death. And as they hauled Professor Barrett and the physicist to their feet, they saw the cause. In the wreckage of the trunk, with his legs folded at an impossible angle for any living man, was the body of Dr. Pertussis. His eyes sunken in, but open and clouded, a large, ugly red wound at his temple, where he had been struck by a heavy object. His mouth, however, was stretched out into an ugly grin of rigor. Barrett struggled against the arms that now held him firm. He looked into the smiling face of his rival and enemy, and then quickly diverted his eyes, as if by not looking he could ignore his guilt. But as he looked away into the shadows, he found that the room was not quite so empty anymore. Beyond the small circle of light and the 27 other living persons, the room was crowded with the dark, human-like shapes of the dead, always present, always watching, always listening, and always waiting. He started to scream. The paper was torn and read aloud. Ghost Lab can suck it.
All right, so I have a story here. Let me see. This one, how do I say this? So, this would be uncomfortable for me to tell at the best of times. And I know these aren't the best of times, but this, dear listeners, is a true story. And it's cold comfort. And yes, it's about Donald Trump and his inexhaustible imagination. I know. But I'm calling this story Mugshot. Listen up. This takes place today, August 25th, 2023, in the real world. Here we go. Donald Trump awoke to the feeling of his butler gently gripping his ankle. Like an overweight arthritic cat, he stretched as best he could, luxuriating in the broad space of his kingly four-poster bed. Then he rolled over, not wanting to give up his dream. His dreams were filthy. "Sir, you requested that I wake you early. Today is the day." Trump smiled broadly as the plan came flooding back into his demented mind. "My mugshot!" He happily slid out of bed with a little bit of help from 2 Secret Service agents and onto his golden wheelchair. In his mind, he strode confidently out of the room, even as the groaning sounds of his overburdened wheelchair creaked. This would be his biggest fundraising day yet. He regretted having to give up the codes, but this was his last chance to secure the position that had been stolen from him 3 years ago. He wouldn't miss this shot. It had all been arranged with the police, who were, of course, on his side. As he was wheeled through the door of his soundproof suite, he made faces, trying to work out the best expression. A smug fuck you? A more subtle, confident, dim-eyed smirk? A piercing, Churchill glare of defiance? He settled on a big shit-eating grin. Donald Trump had been sitting here, resolute, firmly in his own reality, as the rest of the world moved on from the washed-up reality TV star. His break from reality had been long ago. It occurred during an apoplectic outburst as he strained to push out a turd in 2011. He was furious at being zinged by Obama at that evening's correspondence dinner, and he had slipped and nearly split his head open on the side of his toilet. He would have cracked his skull completely, but gold is a forgiving metal. So here he was, an insane, institutionalized loser, unable to understand a damn thing that was happening to him. Still, he knew enough not to give up the codes. He had a vague notion of a malevolent force trying to control him, and the codes were his one bit of leverage. This was going to be his ultimate deal. As Trump prepared for his close-up, a limo pulled up to the outside of Mar-a-Lago Sanatorium. JR snorted a fat rail off the limo's bar, and Ivanka went over her plan. Eric heard, but did not listen. Tiffany slept, so Ivanka was ultimately talking herself through it. "It's all worked out. We just have to be casual about it. We'll wait until he's in front of the camera, all is set, and then we ask for the codes. It's got to be a prerequisite to taking the mugshot, and no negotiations." What makes you so sure it'll work this time? Old man's wily AF, Don Jr. said, gritting his teeth and sweating. "It's all about carrots and sticks, Don. We've been trying sticks. This mugshot is the carrot." The 4 of them were buzzed in, and the large metal doors of Mar-a-Lago unlocked from within. Another buzz could be heard from the room beyond. They entered. A doctor came rushing in, mustache bristling. "Now, what's all this here? He tried to stop them, standing broad-armed in the narrow hallway. "I must protest. You have no business seeing Donald today. He told me all about your plans. You've got it into his head that you'll take his mugshot in exchange for his nuclear codes." Here the doctor's fingers wiggled in air quotes. The 4 of them continued to advance on the doctor as he backed up, still blocking their progress. "You 4 cause trouble every time you visit. We can't have a repeat of 2020. "It wasn't our fault that you couldn't get a handle on a common flu in this madhouse," countered Tiffany. The doctor lowered his tone, attempting to rein in the conversation, even as he backed down the hall. Now, you know your father is exceptionally persuasive, even with his current mental condition. We can't afford another riot in here. Ivanka stepped ahead of the others, leaning into the doctor's face. We just need one photo, and we'll never visit again. Never? Never. The doctor looked down and from side to side and began to nod. Well, okay then. They entered the room where Donald waited. He had just finished his morning shake. Trump sucked food through a straw these days. A nurse mopped up his face and removed his bib. Thank you, Rudy, Trump said, his eyes fixed on his children. To Trump, they were police. I'm ready for my booking, he said with a grin. Well, you know what we need then, Ivanka urged, holding up her phone. She was both casual and stern. I do. The numbers are 36, 24, 36, 69, 17. Did you get that, Eric? Got it. Ivanka couldn't believe it. She had it. All right, take his picture and let's get going. Trump grinned. Junior snapped. They all left. Trump was wheeled back into the common room. He was elated. He would be president again. He heard, but did not listen, to the television in the corner of the room. On it, President Sanders was giving a press conference celebrating a broadly supported bipartisan infrastructure bill. Trump and everyone else in the inside knew better than to listen to the fake news. There was a whole country out there, a whole world that was ready for his triumphant return to the national stage. Donald could feel the donations rolling in now as his mugshot was plastered over every social media feed, every television, every billboard, and drawn in the sky. There would be t-shirts, posters, merch galore. The donations were rolling in. He felt them. He could always feel money, could feel it move. He was now a very wealthy man. Attention was power. That's it for the Campfire Club. The story ends tonight, where, out there somewhere in the real world, the fortune of a dynasty will go missing. Let us pray that he never finds out. That's the one little bit of news that even Dr. Lindell won't be able to soften. It's the one bit of news that might snap our former president out of his dream. And if that happens, you and me and this whole Campfire Club, of course, will not be. It's the least haunted Campfire Club. The least haunted Campfire Club. Oh, it's the least haunted Campfire Club picture show.
The Least Haunted podcast is recorded before a dead studio audience and is a presentation of Sequoia Productions, LLC.